Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the cultures behind the stories we are about to explore. The tales shared here come from many peoples, lands, and traditions. I do not change these stories to fit modern expectations or to align with today's social standards. Instead, I present them as they were told, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh, sometimes challenging. We are not here to judge the past, but to understand it, to listen, to learn, and to honor the ancestors who carried these stories forward. We also share stories from various religious traditions. These are presented in their historical and spiritual context, with respect for their beliefs that they represent. Every culture deserves respect, context, and acknowledgement, and this space is dedicated to doing exactly that. August 16th, The Ashes. Story 1, Pompeii Beneath the Ash. On an ordinary morning in 79 CE, the Roman city of Pompeii was alive beneath the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. Bakers worked beside their ovens, merchants opened shops, cars moved through stone streets, fountains supplied neighborhood water, political notices covered walls, and gardens grew behind painted houses. Pompeii had already survived earthquakes, including a major one 17 years earlier, and rebuilding was still underway in parts of the city. Vesuvius was simply part of the landscape. Then, sometime in the eruption traditionally dated in late August, though modern evidence has led many scholars to favor an autumn date, the mountain violently awakened. A towering column of volcanic material rose above Vesuvius and spread across the sky. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the Bay of Naples, later described the cloud as resembling a great pine tree, rising upward before spreading its branches. Pumice began raining onto Pompeii. At first, the stones were small enough for people to attempt escape beneath pillows tied over their heads. But the eruption continued hour after hour. Roofs accumulated enormous weight. Buildings began collapsing. Darkness swallowed the city even though daylight should have remained. Some residents fled. Others sheltered inside homes, shops, and public buildings, perhaps believing the worst would eventually pass. It did not. During the later stages of the eruption, devastating pyroclastic currents, surging mixtures of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris swept through the area. By the time Vesuvius quieted, Pompeii had disappeared beneath meters of volcanic material. The city that had been filled with voices was sealed in silence. Yet the destruction created an extraordinary paradox. The same eruption that devastated Pompeii also preserved astonishing traces of it. Buildings remained beneath the deposits. Painted walls survived inside buried rooms. Graffiti scratched by ordinary Romans remained legible. Bread was carbonized inside ovens. Shops, temples, baths, gardens, streets, household shrines, jewelry, tools, and everyday objects waited beneath the ground for centuries. When systematic excavations began in the 18th century, an ancient Roman city slowly emerged from beneath the volcanic layers. Archaeologists eventually encountered cavities within hardened ash where human bodies had decomposed long before. In the 19th century, excavator Giuseppe Fiorelli developed the technique of pouring plaster onto these spaces, creating casts that preserve the positions of some of Pompeii's victims of death. These figures are among archaeology's most haunting remains, but Pompeii is more than the story of its final hours. Its destruction preserved evidence of how people actually lived. Archaeologists can study meals, businesses, religious practices, architecture, gardens, political campaigns, entertainment, slavery, wealth, poverty, and family life with an intimacy rarely possible elsewhere in the Roman world. Even Pompeii's landscape eventually changed again. Volcanic deposits weather over time, releasing minerals into the earth. In the wider region around, Vesuvius became famous for productive volcanic soils supporting vineyards and agriculture. The eruption of 79 CE was catastrophic for the people who experienced it. Nothing about later fertility erases that human loss. But Pompeii reveals the strange double nature of volcanic destruction. Ash can bury a world, preserve it, alter the soil beneath another generation's feet, and become part of a landscape where life eventually returns. Beneath Vesuvius, destruction did not disappear from history. It became the very material through which an ancient city could one day speak again. Story 2. Krakatoa and the Return of Life. For generations, people living along the Sunda Strait, the narrow waterway between the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra, knew Krakatoa as part of a landscape shaped by volcanoes. Indonesia sits along one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth, where mountains can nourish the soil for centuries and then transform entire landscape within hours. In 1883, Krakatoa demonstrated that power on a scale witnessed around the world. Activity intensified through the spring and summer with explosions, ash columns, and earthquakes warning that something enormous was unfolding beneath the islands. Then, on August 26th and 27th, the eruption reached its catastrophic climax. A series of tremendous explosions tore through Krakatoa. The largest was so powerful that its sound traveled thousands of kilometers and was reported across an extraordinary portion of the Indian Ocean region. Pressure waves circled the planet, while ash and volcanic material were thrown high into the atmosphere. Much of the volcanic island collapsed into the sea, generating enormous tsunamis that struck the coast of Java and Sumatra. Coastal settlements were swept away. More than 36,000 people were killed, most by the waves. When the eruption ended, the landscape around Krakatoa had been radically altered. Much of the original island was gone. Nearby islands were buried beneath hot ash and pumice. Vegetation had been stripped away across devastated areas, leaving surfaces that appeared almost completely lifeless. Yet this destruction created something scientists would watch with extraordinary interest: the return of an ecosystem. In the years following the eruption, researchers documented life gradually recolonizing the devastated islands. Wind carried microscopic spores and seeds. Ocean currents delivered driftwood, fruits, and other plant material. Insects arrived by air or upon floating debris. Birds crossed the water and carried seeds within their bodies or clinging to feathers and feet. Ferns and grasses appeared among the earliest vegetation, followed over time by shrubs and increasingly complex forests. Animals arrived as habitat developed. The rebuilding did not happen because the eruption had somehow been beneficial to the people or ecosystems it destroyed. It happened because life is remarkably capable of occupying newly available ground. Krakatoa became a natural laboratory for scientists studying ecological succession, the process through which biological communities establish and change over time. And the volcanic story itself was not finished. In 1927, eruptions beneath the water began building a new volcanic island within the old caldera. Indonesians named it Anak Krakatau, the child of Krakatau. Eruption after eruption added material until the new volcano rose above the sea. Vegetation repeatedly attempted to colonize its young slopes, even as later eruptions altered them again. In 2018, part of Anak Krakatau collapsed during an eruption, producing another deadly tsunami in the Sunda Strait. The history of Krakatoa therefore resists any simple story in which destruction occurs once and nature neatly repairs everything afterward. This landscape is continually being made, broken, and made again. Forests can grow upon volcanic ash. A new island can rise where an older one collapsed. Seeds can reach ground that only years earlier had been buried beneath eruption debris. Krakatoa remains dangerous precisely because the geological forces that created this renewal remain active beneath it. But more than a century after the devastation of 1883, its islands also carry forests, animals, and ecosystems that did not exist in their present form before the eruption. Krakatoa did not return to what it had been. Something new grew in the space the eruption left behind. Story 3: The Fires of Mount Fuji. For centuries, Mount Fuji, Fujisan, had risen above central Japan as both a volcano and a sacred mountain, its nearly symmetrical summit appearing serene even though it was created by repeated eruptions. To the people living around it, Fuji was never merely scenery. The mountain possessed a presence powerful enough to inspire reverence, pilgrimage, fear, poetry, art, and worship. In early Japanese religious life, mountains were understood as places where the human and sacred worlds could meet. And extraordinary features of the landscape could be associated with kami, sacred presences or divine powers within Shinto tradition. Fuji's eruptions made that power impossible to ignore. One of the mountain's most consequential periods of activity came in 864 CE, during the Jogan eruption. Lava poured from vents on Fuji's northwest flank and spread across the landscape below. Forests disappeared beneath molten rock. The lava entered lakes at the mountain's base, reshaping waterways and altering the geography of the region. What had once been living ground hardened into black volcanic stone. The eruption was so significant that it appears in Japan's historical chronicles, which record efforts by the imperial court to respond ritually to the mountain's unrest. Officials interpreted the disaster within the religious understanding of their time and ordered worship connected with the kami of Fuji. Shrines associated with the sama or senjin worship became increasingly important in traditions devoted to calming and honoring the volcanic mountain. Over the centuries, the deity associated with Fuji became strongly identified with Konohana Sakuyo Hime, the blossom princess of Japanese mythology. Her imagery seems almost paradoxical beside an erupting volcano, delicate blossoms associated with beauty and briefness connected to a mountain capable of sending fire across forests. Yet Fuji itself contains the same contradiction. Destruction and beauty occupy the same slopes. After the Jogan eruption, life eventually began reclaiming portions of the hardened lava. Mosses and plants established themselves where conditions allowed. Seeds took root in cracks and pockets of developing soil. Forests gradually returned across parts of the volcanic landscape. Today, the famous Okigahara forest grows over portions of the lava produced by the 9th century eruption. Beneath its trees lies an irregular foundation of volcanic rock, a physical reminder that the forest exists upon ground once remade by fire. Fuji erupted again many times in Japanese history. Its most recent confirmed eruption, the Hoye eruption of 1707, opened vents on the mountain's southeastern flank and sent enormous quantities of ash across surrounding regions, even reaching Edo, modern Tokyo, more than 100 kilometers away. Fields were buried, agriculture was disrupted, and communities faced years of difficult recovery. Yet Fuji remained sacred. Rather than separating reverence from danger, Japanese traditions surrounding the mountain developed while both realities remained visible. Pilgrims climbed its slopes. Religious communities practiced austerities there. Artists transformed its profile into one of Japan's enduring cultural images. Shrines stood within a landscape repeatedly created by volcanic activity. Mount Fuji therefore carries the history of a mountain that can destroy the ground beneath human feet, and over centuries become the foundation beneath entirely new forests. Okigahara did not erase the Jogan lava. Its roots grew through and over it. The stone remained beneath the living world, while life learned the shape of the ground it had been given. Story 4: Yellowstone After the Fire. Long before Yellowstone became a national park, its mountains, rivers, geysers, forests, and great herds existed within the homelands and histories of indigenous peoples. Many native nations have long-standing connections to the Yellowstone region, including the Shoshone, Bannock, Crow, Blackfeet, Nez Perce, and other peoples who traveled through, hunted within, gathered plants from, traded across, and maintained cultural relationships within this extraordinary landscape. Fire was part of that world too. Some fires came from lightning. Others were intentionally set by indigenous peoples for practical and ecological purposes, including influencing vegetation, maintaining traveled areas, encouraging useful plants, and shaping habitat for animals. Fire was therefore not always understood simply as an enemy arriving to destroy a healthy landscape. It could also be one of the forces through which a landscape continually changed. That truth became spectacularly visible in 1988, when Yellowstone experienced one of the largest fire seasons in its recorded history. A combination of drought, heat, dry vegetation, and strong winds allowed numerous fires, some caused by lightning and others by people, to spread across the greater Yellowstone landscape. By the end of the season, fires had affected roughly 793,000 acres within Yellowstone National Park, close to one-third of the park. Images of enormous flames and blackened forests traveled around the world. To many observers, Yellowstone appeared ruined. Lodgepole pines stood burned across vast areas. Wildlife habitat seemed devastated. Questions arose about whether the park could ever look the same again. But beneath the blackened trunks, the next forest had already been prepared. Lodgepole pine, one of Yellowstone's dominant tree species, possesses an extraordinary adaptation to landscape where fire is common. Some lodgepole pines produce serotinous cones, sealed tightly with resin. The heat of a fire can melt that resin and allow the cones to open, releasing seeds onto newly exposed ground. Fire removes portion of the dense canopy above. Sunlight reaches the forest floor, and nutrients become available within the altered soil. In places that appeared empty after 1988, countless seedlings stood emerged. Grasses and wildflowers returned. Aspen produced new growth. Animals moved through the burned landscapes, using different stages of recovering habitat in different ways. Even dead trees remained useful, becoming shelter, feeding insects and fungi, and eventually returning nutrients to the soil as they decomposed. Yellowstone had not escaped destruction. The fires had genuinely killed trees, displaced animals, altered watersheds, damaged structures, and transformed enormous areas of forest. But ecologists watching afterward recognized something important. A burned forest is not necessarily a dead ecosystem. Fire is one of the processes that has shaped many Rocky Mountain ecosystems for thousands of years. The young forests growing after 1988 were not repairing Yellowstone back in the exact landscape that existed before the flames. They were becoming the next version of Yellowstone, and that cycle existed long before the modern park boundary. Indigenous peoples knew landscapes in which human beings, animals, plants, weather, and fire interacted across generations. Today, indigenous fire knowledge is increasingly discussed alongside ecological science in broader conversation about how North American landscapes have historically lived with fire. Yellowstone offers a particularly dramatic example of why the aftermath matters. Stand in portions of the park today, and the evidence of 1988 has not disappeared. New forest rises among the remnants of the old. Fallen trunks return slowly to earth. Trees born after the flames now reach high above visitors who were not alive when the fires burned. The ashes did not restore what was lost. They became part of the ground from which something else could grow. Daily Thread for August 16th. What grows from my loss? Yesterday we stood before the pyre and asked what must end. Today the flames are gone. What remains is ash, altered ground, and the strange silence that follows destruction. This is the part of transformation we speak about less often. We celebrate beginnings and ritualize endings, but between them lies the aftermath, when something is gone and whatever comes next has not yet fully appeared. Today's stories bring us into that uncertain ground. At Pompeii, Vesuvius buried an entire Roman city beneath volcanic material. The catastrophe killed people and ended a living community. Yet the same ash that covered Pompeii preserved streets, homes, paintings, graffiti, food, and ordinary moments for centuries beneath the earth. Destruction became an accidental archive. At Krakatoa, the eruption of 1883 devastated islands and coastal communities. But afterward, scientists watched life slowly return to seemingly barren ground. Spores arrived, seeds traveled by wind and sea, insects and birds followed. Eventually, forests rose where the eruption had radically transformed the landscape. And Mount Fuji, lava from the Jogan eruption hardened across the earth. The centuries of growth eventually produced forests over portions of that volcanic stone. The old lava did not need to disappear before roots could take hold. And at Yellowstone, the fires of 1988 left enormous stretches of forest blackened. Yet heat also opened lodgepole pine cones and released seeds onto newly exposed ground. The next forest began among the remains of the one that had burned. None of these stories ask us to pretend destruction is secretly wonderful. Loss is loss. People killed by an eruption are not compensated by fertile soil centuries later. A forest growing again does not mean the forest that burned was meaningless. Renewal does not cancel grief. It exists beside it. That distinction matters because when we experience loss, people often rush toward the lesson. Everything happens for a reason. Something better will come. Look at the bright side. But ashes do not demand optimism. For a while, they are simply evidence that something was here and now it is not. Growth may come later, and when it does, it may look nothing like what existed before. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of fertile ground. Healing is not always restoration. Sometimes we cannot rebuild the old city, regrow the exact forest, recover the former relationship, return to the previous dream, or become the person we were before something happened. The ground itself has changed, so we grow differently. A seed landing on volcanic rock does not spend its life demanding ordinary soil. It finds the crack where roots can enter. A young pine does not recreate the tree that burned before it. It becomes its own tree, and perhaps we are allowed to do the same. So today's question is not, how do I get back what I lost? It is, what grows from my loss? Maybe the answer is strength, maybe discernment, maybe a boundary you should have built years ago, maybe compassion for someone whose pain you finally understand, maybe a new dream occupying the space left by one that can no longer survive, or maybe you are still standing in the ashes and nothing is growing yet. That is allowed too. Fertile ground does not sprout the morning after the fire. Some landscapes need seasons. For today, simply notice one thing that exists in you now that did not exist before the loss. Name it, write it down, let it be small. You do not have to be grateful for the fire to recognize what has begun growing after it. The ashes are not proof that nothing remains. Sometimes they are simply the first ground beneath the life that has not introduced itself yet.